Last week in our gospel lesson, Jesus came to his disciples and taught them how to be reconciled to one another and offer forgiveness in the church. And after that teaching, Peter asked him a very important question, one that Ms. Lukenbach talked about in her children's sermon. And after giving the number, I am sure everyone was quite surprised and asked, how do we do this? And then Jesus gave a very important parable teaching us how to forgive. And that is found in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, beginning in verse 21. Peter came to Jesus and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him $6 billion was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all of his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him $10,000. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused, and then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. And then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all of that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. And so my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. As I begin, I'd like to ask, can I just be brutally honest with you this morning? Well, I guess it really doesn't matter if you answer yes or no. I was going to be brutally with you anyways, but because I was afraid that if I gave you too much leeway on that, you might actually say no, and then I wouldn't have a sermon to preach. Maybe I should have started it differently. Maybe I should have just said, my brothers and sisters, I'm going to be brutally honest with you this morning. But what am I going to be brutally honest with you about? Just this. Even though we in the church talk a lot about forgiveness, and even though many of us would like to think that we practice forgiveness, the reality is we don't like forgiving others. Period. Not one bit. And don't get me wrong, I know we like being forgiven because we all know that we mess up. We all know that we make mistakes. We all know that there are times when we have hurt someone else and that we know at a minimum we deserve a tongue lashing. At a maximum we deserve punishment. But rather than wanting that, we want mercy. We don't want to pay the penalty. We don't want to face the music. We don't want punishment. We want to be forgiven. You see, I remember as a child, I used to play with my parents' vinyl record turntable. Now, for those of you who are younger than us Gen Xers, you need to know that we didn't have MP3 and MP4 players. We didn't have digital music. We had 8 tracks, then we had vinyl records, and then it moved to cassette tapes. That's what we had. But I understand actually that some of you millennials and younger actually are getting back in tune with vinyl records, and they're actually coming back in style. But that's beside the point. The point I'm making is I used to play with my parents' turntable. It had this switch that I thought was really cool. It was kind of a slide that you pulled up and down, and it would make the table start spinning. And I thought it was really great fun to do that for some reason or another. I was easily entertained as a kid. But one day I was playing with it and I pulled it too hard and snap. I was like, uh-oh. I was worried. I was terrified. I was scared. I knew I was going to get a spanking. And so I was sitting there thinking what I wanted to do. I thought about running and hiding. I thought about doing anything I could do to avoid that. But I decided finally it would be better for me to at least maybe try to own up and show that I was taking responsibility. So I went and told my mom. because I figured my mom was either less likely to give me a spanking, or if she did, it wouldn't hurt as bad as Dad. So I showed her the part and I told her what I had done, and guess what I received? I didn't even receive a tongue lashing. I received blessed forgiveness. And I can remember that to this day, even though this happened over 40 years ago. It was awesome. But here's the question. Do you think I offered my sister that same kind of forgiveness when she broke one of my toys? Oh, absolutely not. Why? Because it's easy to receive forgiveness, but it's much more harder to give it, because we want justice, we want retribution, we want what is due us. And we see this manifesting itself all over our society today. I mean, justice is one of those buzzwords that we hear all the time. Sometimes it has the word social in front of it. Sometimes it just stands there by itself. But you see it, you hear it all over the place. People are standing in the streets and shouting and demanding justice. And sometimes they are doing more than just standing and shouting. But I'm going to stop right here before I go too far, because this sermon is not a commentary about what is going on in society, although it will have some definite implications about how we live as a society. This sermon is about forgiveness and how, at least in the church, our primary focus is not on justice. And don't get me wrong when I say that. We still work for a just society. We still work for a just world. But our primary tool for bringing about justice is actually forgiveness. And so with that being said, let me take a moment to define what I mean by forgiveness, because in our day and age today, our definitions get muddy. We're not always on the same page when it comes to understanding things. And so let me tell you what I believe the biblical definition of forgiveness is. It is paying for somebody else's wrongdoing. Forgiveness is absorbing the pain, the anger, the monetary cost of someone else's actions that may or may not have been directed at you. For instance, when I broke my parents' turntable, they paid to have it fixed, and I didn't. In forgiveness, you pay, while the one who hurt you gets off free. And that, my brothers and sisters, is why forgiveness is so doggone hard. That's why we don't see much of it. We would rather not absorb the pain, the hurt, the cost. And yet, forgiveness is at the core of Christianity. Forgiveness is at the core of Jesus' teachings. Pastor Casey introduced us to that last week in his sermon as he talked about reconciliation within the church and the process we are called to use when a brother or sister sins against us. But after he teaches that, Peter wants to push the envelope. Peter wants to know, how many times do I have to do this forgiveness, Jesus? 7 times? Because it's funny what Peter is doing right here. Because in the ancient Jewish tradition, the Jewish rabbis had gotten together and they had asked the question, how many times do I have to forgive somebody? And they had hemmed and hawed, they had wrestled, they'd argued. And they came up with a number of 3. You have to forgive someone 3 times. Then you can blast them. And so Peter, knowing that Jesus tends to go a little further than the rabbis, says, okay, I'll take what the rabbis say, I will double it, I will add 1. I will get one of the perfect numbers in the Bible, which is the number 7, and I'll throw that out to Jesus. Surely Jesus will commend me. Surely Jesus will pat me on the back. Surely Jesus might even say, hey, you've gone too far, Peter. Take the number down. But no one could have expected what Jesus said. Jesus looked at the disciples, looked at Peter and said, no, not 7 times. Truly, I tell you, 77 times. Or as Ms. Lukenbach said, it's 70 times 7. In the Greek right here, there's different manuscripts that have 2 different numbers. One set of manuscripts has 77. The other has 70 times 7. You may get a Bible that says one or the 2 of those. The translation that I used had 77. The translation that Ms. Lukenbach used had 70 times 7. They're both attested to in the Greek. They're both equally attested to. So, and the point is really here, it's not the number. It's not 77, it's not 490 times. It's not like you pull out your phone and you pull up an app that has how many times someone has hurt me, and you're like, 76, 70. Oh, next time I get to bust them one. That's not the point. Jesus' point is that forgiveness is something that comes natural to a Christian. Forgiveness is something that we just do over and over again. It's our primary way of handling someone who sins against us, who hurts us, who damages us or our reputation or our being. We do not seek justice against that person. We seek forgiveness. That's Jesus' point. But the next question is how? I mean, that's $1 million question. How do you pay the cost over and over and over with someone who hurts you? How do you absorb the pain, the hurt, the monetary cost, the damages? How do you take that in over and over and over again when it seems like you're letting yourself get taken advantage of, when somebody keeps hurting you? How in the world do you do this? Especially when our natural instinct is to get revenge, to get even. You see, Jesus knows this. Jesus knows that's what the status of our hearts is. Jesus knows how we react. Jesus knows that forgiveness does not come easily for us, even one time. And so he tells his disciples, and he tells us a parable. And that parable is a story of how our hearts change so that we can lead with forgiveness. And Jesus begins the parable talking about a king who brought all of his slaves together to settle accounts with them. And the first slave is brought forward. And this slave owes the equivalent of like $6 billion. $6 billion. How do you go into debt that much? I don't know. I mean, you think about this for just a minute. I mean, you want to put that into perspective. You would have to spend $1,648,000 per day for 10 years to accumulate that much debt. How do you do that? I really don't know. Somebody in first service said credit cards. I don't know. But I do know a couple of things. First thing that we know from this is the king is incredibly rich. I mean, if he can loan that much money to one slave and still have money to lend to other slaves, this king is mega wealthy. And the king is, I would say, overly trustworthy, almost to a fault. He's basically allowed his slaves to do whatever they want. And did that lead to abuse? Yeah, I think so. Because we know that this slave who owed $6 billion is pretty unscrupulous. Either that or he is possibly the worst money manager in the history of the world. Either way, this combination has given us a head-shaking scenario. This slave owes $6 billion. And of course, the king seeks to recoup his investment. And as one might expect, the slave could not pay. So well within his rights as a king in that day and age, the king declares he will sell the slave's family, all the slave's possessions, to get back some what is owed. And to our sensibilities, this might sound harsh, but I mean, we're looking at it from an outside perspective. We're looking at it from a perspective that is far removed from that day and age. I guarantee you, if someone owed you $6 billion, you would probably do what was ever in your legal right to reclaim that debt. And that's exactly what the king seeks to do. But the slave does not go quietly. He begs for a chance to pay. He falls on his knees in an act of obedience, and he says, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." The slave was very poor with money, and he was very poor with the truth. That's a lie. How in the world are you going to pay back $6 billion? You can't. That's an impossibility. But at the very least, what the slave is doing is throwing himself on the mercy of his master. At the very least, he is seeking for an act of kindness, an act of compassion, an act of mercy. And the slave is not disappointed. In fact, the master, the king, gives him much more than he ever bargained for. The master is filled with compassion. In the Greek, the word is his guts turn to mush. It's like if you've ever been on Facebook or something and you see a picture of one of those cute puppies that they're trying to get you to adopt, and you look at that puppy's eyes and your insides just melt, you just fall in love and you want to grab them, hug them, and hold them. That's what happens to this king's guts. Exactly that. And he does something amazing. Two things, in fact. The first thing he does is release the slave. Gives him his freedom. And then he takes away his debt. It's gone. The slave is no longer obligated. He's no longer bound. He no longer has that huge sum hanging over his head. The slave is now completely, totally free. That's stunning. And I want us to stop just a minute here and contemplate this. And I want to point something out. I mean, this is an amazing gift, and in the church, we would call it grace. Because this slave certainly didn't deserve it. He didn't earn it. It was done completely and totally by the king. And here's the thing. It cost the king dearly. I mean, I know there are some who say that forgiveness is free, but I'm not sure they fully understand what happens in forgiveness. If your bank forgives you a loan, who pays the loan? The bank. If your friend lends you $20 and then later on says, forget about it, who actually pays the loan? Your friend. That $6 billion didn't just evaporate. The king ate it. He paid it. He lost every bit of that money because of his goodness, because of his generosity and kindness. Absolutely free to the slave. Very costly to the king. And that is a point well worth remembering. And it would be nice if the story simply ended here with everyone living happily ever after. But that's not where Jesus stops. Remember, this is a story about the reality of grace and forgiveness. It's a story about learning to forgive. And being forgiven is only step one. And that's why Jesus continues. The slave who had been forgiven now comes across one of his fellow slaves. This fellow slave owes the forgiven slave $10,000. Now, that's not a small amount. It's not a small amount, but in comparison to the first slave's debt, it's peanuts, it's minuscule, it's nothing. But that first slave acts as if it's everything. He demands that his fellow slave pay him. He grabs his fellow slave by the collar and begins throttling him. That's kind of what's in the Greek nuance. And I mean, I can just picture this scene in my head, this forgiven slave holding his fellow slave by the throat and slapping him with every word, "Give me my money." It's horrid. But the slave doesn't have the money. And it's no coincidence that the fellow slave says the exact same thing that the first slave said to the king. "Be patient with me, I'll pay you." And unlike the first time these words were uttered, the second time is not a lie. The debt could be paid. But that first slave will have none of it. None. He throws his fellow slave into prison until the debt can be paid. And there are other slaves around, and they see this going on, and they're greatly distressed by what they have seen. They've seen the first slave receive forgiveness, and then they see how he treated his fellow slave. So they go back and they report to the king. And the king becomes angry. Extremely angry. He brings that first slave before him. And where there once was kindness and compassion, there is now only judgment. You wicked slave. I forgave you $6 billion. $6 billion. And you could not forgive your fellow slave? I gave you compassion. What did you give? What did you dole out? You received forgiveness, but now you demand punishment. Is that just? Is that right? You wanted justice. You wanted your due. Well, I will give you justice. I will give you your due. Your debt is now reinstated. You are now put back in chains. You will be tortured now until you pay the entire debt. Now, some of you may recoil here at the king's actions. Let me ask you this, though. What would you do? What would you do if you had forgiven someone that much debt and then that person turned around and went to someone who was weak, who was helpless, and then oppressed them? in the manner that the slave did, would you walk away scot-free? Or would you take action as well? You see, this king's actions are completely just. The punishment is fitting the crime. The king is giving nothing more than is deserved. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and finishes out, "So it will be to you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." And I think that last phrase is so important, from your heart, because forgiveness is a heart issue. It's an issue that hits us right at the core. Our hearts are hardwired for justice. Our hearts are hardwired to seek an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Our hearts are hardwired to demand what is rightfully ours. And when we are wronged, by God, we want the person who wronged us to feel the same pain that we felt. That's a natural state of our hearts. And so in order to forgive, our hearts have to change. To be able to forgive means our hearts have to become different. And how does that happen? And the key is in the parable. And that key is to recognize the grace that has been given. The first slave didn't have that capability. The first slave didn't care a flip about what his king had done for him. The first slave was totally and completely focused on himself. He didn't recognize the size of his debt, and he didn't recognize the generosity and provision of the master. Therefore, he had no gratitude. He had no joy. Because of his inability to see the grace that had been given to him, he could not extend that grace to others. And so the question then becomes, what about you and me? What about us? Do we see it? Do we see the grace that has been extended to us? Do we see the size of the debt that we have accumulated towards God? Do we see how each and every time we have failed to live up to God's commands, we have incurred a debt that we cannot pay? Every time we have acted in anger, every time we have failed to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to visit the sick and in prison, every time we have looked at another with lust in our hearts, every time we have put our pursuits of money, sports, politics, possessions, sex, or what have you over our pursuit of God, every time we have uttered an insult, every time we have failed to act as Jesus acted and love like Jesus loved, we have accumulated debt. Can you see the size of the debt? Can you see how dreadfully we have sinned? How could we ever repay? How could we ever give what is due? We can't. But then do you see the size of the provision? Do you see how God has absorbed our debt? Do you see how God, Jesus, God in human flesh said, "Give your debt to me, for the wages of sin is death, and I will die the death that you deserve. I will pay what you cannot. I will suffer what you should suffer, and I will not ask a dime. I will ask for no repayment. I will pay it all. All that you have done, all that you are doing, all that you will do, I will take care of it. And I will give you my status as sinless, righteous, beloved child of God, forgiven, free, whole. Because I live, you shall live also. Trust in my provision. Trust in my promises." Oh, and can't you see, dear Christian, that if you see the size of your debt, and then if you see the size of the provision, if you can see the price that God paid for you, your heart will leap. Your heart will change. Your heart will know God's great grace. And then you will be able to forgive. You will be able to absorb the costs of another's actions over and over and over. Because you will be able to realize how small a price it is compared to the price that was paid for you. And imagine Just imagine our world if such forgiveness was practiced by all. Can I be brutally honest with you? It would be awesome. Amen.